Everybody. So we're moving on to our next topic in the global conflict unit, and today we're going to talk primarily about conducting World War One. Now, this lecture is going to be based off of the curriculum that AP puts out, and so that does not include specific battles and other things that happen in World War One as far as specific details. And so if you are interested in stuff like that, there are some YouTube videos that I'd recommend to help you understand or learn a little bit more about that. The oversimplified videos are pretty good at kind of going on a basic overview of how World War One unfolds. But I'll link those into the Canvas page, and that is going to just be something a little bit extra for you. But today we are going to focus on several main aspects. Number one, your essential questions are going to be identify, explain how World War One was a total war, and the second part is going to be identify, explain what causes the dramatic increase of wartime casualties during World War One. So this first thing that the College Board curriculum has, the language of the curriculum is World War One was the first total war. And so what is total war? It is essentially is a war that involves all peoples of all country, civilians and military personnel. And there's going to be doctors, scientists, engineers, workers are all going to play a role in contributing to the war efforts itself. So it's an everyone on deck situation. That also means that everybody is a target of casualties, and so there will be large amount of civilians that die during this war because again, it's a total war. It's a country against a country, right? But governments use a variety of strategies, including political propaganda, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism to mobilize populations from both countries and the colonies, because, especially the British and the French, they will mobilize a lot of the people within their colonies to help fight this war too. And is all done for the purpose of waging war. So as far as specifically we're going to talk about, and we want to focus mainly on propaganda. Propaganda is messages and that are trying to get people to react in a way that it's going to support whatever the people are wanting people to do. Those who are making the propaganda to get people to do something they want. And oftentimes they're trying to invoke some sort of emotional response, right? Right here we have these two. And I imagine a lot of people have seen, this is one of the most famous propaganda posters of all time. If you go down to a recruiting station today, you would likely see this, up on like the outside of the windows or something along those lines. But this is kind of trying to invoke that sense of nationalism. Like, your country needs you. You can't just sit there and ignore it. Women of Britain say go. This is invoking like you're doing this to help the women and protect the women and such. That's you just don't say no to women, right? This one is another British one where it's invoking this that the Germans are monsters, and so it's something that gets you angry. Your Liberty Bonds will help stop this. It's that call of sense of duty. Again, this sense of nationalism. This is a Canadian poster, and it's trying to target, in particularly French Canadians, the Quebecois, and they want to have this national identity that they need to go help their people they share a cultural identity with the French. So that's something that they are promoting. This one's one of my favorites. This is a United States one, and the U.S. will not join this war for the first 3 years of it. But to destroy the mad brutes, you have, this King Kong looking figure with a German helmet on. They have a club that's got blood on it. It says culture on it with a K. And then you can't see it down here, but it says America, and so it's implying that if you don't do something, that the Germans will come here and brutalize America like they brutalized Europe, and is what they're promoting. And then the woman, is it Lady Liberty? Is it Columbia? Regardless, it is certainly kind of invokes that fear that democracy is under threat in some way. and there's more, like turn your silver into bullets, and so just like small little things that these propaganda posters are trying to get them to do, like rationing and buying war bonds, promoting women and others who are not going to fight to go into the factories and build munitions and things for the war. So this is all happening there, and then trying to mobilize their people to get on board with the war effort in some way, and everyone's got to play a role, and that's why it makes it a total war. There's also, I mean, the Allied powers weren't the only ones that were using propaganda. All of the Central powers were too. This is a German one where if this is if you don't do something, then this is how the Rhineland would look and such, and it's the French will come and destroy their lands. So invoking that fear and that sense of duty and patriotism. The other posters here, I'm pretty sure, let's see, that's a German one, or Austro-Hungarian, I can't tell. I think it's Austro-Hungarian. This one's an Ottoman one, which the Ottoman Empire joins the Central Powers, as we talked about in previous lectures. And it says, we're mobilizing all men to arms. First day of mobilization is, and then, it intentionally leaves it blank because they're not sure when they're joined, but they're trying to get people who need to get ready for war and to sign up now. So then, these are some more propaganda examples, and propaganda was used quite often. And propaganda took many different forms. It took art, it took posters, radio plays a role in this as well. And ultimately, it's just trying to get people to do, to either be angry, to have a sense of nationalism and duty, to be scared of the potential future. If you don't do something, these things will happen. So this is how they motivate and mobilize their people to help commit total war in World War I. All right, so we're going to move on to our next part of the curriculum, which is about new military technology leads to an increase of wartime casualties. And World War I was really the first modern industrial war. Some could make the argument that the American Civil War was, and yeah, sure. I mean, but in terms of the numbers of weapons and the dramatic improvement of military technology at this time, it certainly is something that is going to expand much quicker than was anticipated at the beginning of the war. And so what I mean by that is that, entering into World War I, soldiers would ride on horses, and when by the time the war is over, they're leaving on airplanes and tanks. Okay, so there's a huge jump in military technology, and it starts at the beginning of the war, because at the beginning of the war, the military commanders had this idea of how warfare should be conducted, and many of them thought that still the fiercest soldiers on the battlefield would be the cavalry, and it just doesn't pan out that way, and after short time it ends up becoming a stalemate. Military technology just outpaces the tactics that were used, and it leads to a stalemate, a quagmire, whatever you want to call it. But that takes the form of what we call trench warfare during World War I, where both sides will dig into trenches and then periodically go over the top out of the trench and run across this area between the two trenches known as no man's land under heavy machine gun fire to try to push the enemy back. But it is an exercise in futility. You would end up with large amounts of casualties. And yeah, you may take that trench, the enemy's trench, but then they had reserve trenches with more soldiers that they would push in. And, what this ends up happening is a huge amount of casualties because of the trench warfare and the way they fight. And so I will put some more videos in the Canvas that are about trench warfare a little bit, nothing too long in length, but it just gives you a sense of trench warfare and how it unfolds. Being a soldier during this war must have been as miserable as you could be as a person, always, sleeping in mud, and things like trench foot develop, which your feet are constantly wet, so they become to kind of grow a mold on it, and the skin starts to rot off. And it's just unpleasant altogether. But as the war progresses, both sides are going to invest a lot of science, technology, and in ways in which they can try to break the stalemate and open up the lines and be victorious ultimately. But that just never fully happens, and just leads to more casualties. It's not till the end of the war where the lines eventually do break, and there's a number of factors that lead to why that occurs. But one of the military technologies that going into this war is going to be the first time it's used in large scale numbers. Machine guns, like in the form of Gatling guns, where you had like multiple barrels that you would turn a crank and then it would fire. And they were big, they were clumsy, and they weren't very mobile. But as technology improved more so, the machine gun becomes a steadfast part of warfare. And this is a big reason why trench warfare even happens, because charging soldiers across open field, which has been something that has been done in war for forever, no longer is a viable way of winning a war. There is a video that I will connect to on the Canvas page that I definitely think you should watch, and it's from a Disney movie called War Horse. Okay, it's not gory, but it does. I mean, it's war. It's a little violent, right? But it's only about 3 minutes long, and it shows a cavalry charge of British soldiers against a German camp, and the charge is going well up until the moment that the German soldiers retreat to their machine guns, and all it takes is for one or two guys to sit behind the gun and then press the trigger and just go back and forth and mow down the oncoming charge. And that's what you can't protect against that. And that's why the war changes and warfare changes forever with the machine gun. And so both sides will employ it in the front lines, and both sides will create fixed gun positions in their trenches. So if any attack does happen, then all they had to do was get to their machine guns and just start fight against the attack, simply just by feeding bullets into these killing machines. Other things began to introduce in time. One of them would be poison gas, and this is really the only war in which poison gas would be used in the battlefield in large numbers. Not to say that gas wasn't used in World War II; it was, unfortunately, against civilian populations and civilians, especially in the Holocaust. But against soldiers in open war, it just never is used to the level you see in World War I. And you haven't seen it much since. I mean, there are some small example in the history and context of history, some small examples of it being used, but largely this is the only war that we see it deployed in large numbers. But there were several different types of gas. The Germans were the first ones to employ it, trying to break that stalemate. They had these giant canisters of chlorine gas, and when the weather conditions were right, meaning that the wind was blowing in a certain direction, right, towards the enemy's trench, they would open up the canisters and the gas would come out, and it would just slowly, go across no man's land into the camps. And the first troops that were gassed were Canadian soldiers who didn't have gas masks or anything. And what chlorine gas does, it essentially causes your lungs to fill up with liquid, and you drown from the inside out. Later on, other types of gases will be introduced, like mustard gas. Mustard gas will burn the skin. It will burn the eyes. It's a horrendous tool of war, and a lot of people will suffer, life-altering injuries because of gas and gas attacks themselves. So that is something that is introduced and does lead to a numerous amount of more casualties. Because the gas masks, I mean, if you're under a gas attack, you could be in your gas mask for hours, and you'll have to change the filters in between. It's terrible, terrible stuff. So again, trying to break the stalemate, one of the things that presented a lot of complications in trench warfare is that there was literally no cover for soldiers going across no man's land. I mean, they could hide in the artillery shell craters to kind of keep down, but you know, if you longer you stay, the more likely you're going to get hit by artillery. So there's really like nothing to protect them across no man's land because like all of the trees and everything was destroyed between the two of them. So the British are the first to introduce a new technology, simply known as the tank. And this one right here, the Mark I tank, is the first time it will be deployed in the Battle of the Somme, I believe it was. And this was to try to break that stalemate. And they would travel very slowly, like 2 to 3 miles per hour across no man's land. They had machine guns, sometimes they had like little larger guns. And soldiers could use them for cover as they're going across the no man's land. But these things were so big, clunky, and they would break down so often that it really does not break the stalemate. The tank, while itself will be a military technology that will continue especially when we talk about World War II, but in World War I, they just didn't. They weren't fast or mobile enough to be able to break the stalemate, and both sides began to employ their own versions of the tanks. This one right here was a German tank. It's like a giant house that would like move across the no man's land at a pace of 2 miles per hour, which made it an easy target. And of course, anti-tank weapons and artillery and such would be used to knock them out. So it just doesn't work. But the tank is a technology that stays around and changes warfare altogether. You also have planes and zeppelins that are used in this. I'm going to move myself because this is quite a humorous picture. Yeah, the planes themselves were a relatively new technology. The planes were invented by the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. And this is the first war that they would be used in. And originally they were used as a way to, how do I put this? They were as reconnaissance. So they would fly over their enemy's trenches and they would map out the trench and take pictures eventually, and so that the commanders of the militaries could plan out attacks and whatnot. And at first, when planes, both sides would employ these planes, at first is when they fly by each other, they would simply salute each other, right? But, time goes on. They don't want their enemy to be able to fly over their trenches. So, they started bringing up pistols and taking pop shots at each other, and eventually leading to where they would put machine guns on the fronts of the planes themselves so that they could shoot down the enemy planes as well. And so war now is it's not just on the sea and on land, it's now in the air. And other things like strapping explosives to the wings and then having a lever to pull to where they release leads to bombing. Those are things that did happen. And the Zeppelins is a technology that doesn't exist anymore today for obvious reasons, but the Zeppelins that were employed by the Germans would end up leading to where the Germans could bomb cities like Paris and I think London. They even had deployed these giant, what they looked like lawn darts, and they were kinetic weapons. They would just drop from the sky, and then anyone below, and it's done for them, right? So this kind of plays into more of the total war, the bombing of cities, during World War I. But the Zeppelins are something that don't last because they're too slow and they're too big of a target, and airplane technology improves drastically to where they're no longer viable. Other things that get in part of this war, naval technology. They had ships called dreadnoughts, which are very powerful battleships, and both sides, the French and the Germans, had dreadnoughts, but neither side wanted to employ them into war because they were so expensive. They did have one battle, and they did sustain some damage, and that was it. They didn't want to use them anymore because they were so expensive. They didn't want to lose them. But one military technology of this era is something that's going to stay, and that's the submarines. And for the Germans, they were the Unterseeboots, which is undersea boats. And the Germans employed these into war a lot, and they used it to try to create a blockade of England and cut them off from their supplies, especially ones that they were getting from America. Because even though for the first 3 years of the war, the United States stays out of it, that doesn't mean that they didn't sell weapons and other things, materials of war, to the both sides, but primarily to the Allied sides. And so they would do something called unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans. And they would hide under the sea, and they would spot their targets, and without warning, they would torpedo them and try to sink them to the sea. And they mostly focused on merchant ships and anybody that or naval ships as well. But occasionally they did target cruise liners, and the most famous and infamous one is the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was a White Star liner, which is the same company that Titanic ran, and it was torpedoed and sunk. And roughly, I can't remember how many, but almost 2,000 people. You might want to look that up to double check me. Die from that incident itself. And that made countries like the United States very angry that the Germans certainly did not play the rules of war according to what the international community thought, and targeting civilian boats was against that. So it's one of the reasons why the United States will eventually join the war is unrestricted submarine warfare. After the Lusitania and another boat they sink called the Sussex, which was an American merchant ship, they do pledge for some time they're not going to get involved in the war, but eventually they lift that, and that's one of the final straws for the Americans and why they joined the war. There's other military technologies that lead to a large loss of life. Mortars, which you see on the left here. Of course, flamethrowers, which were technology that would have been really effective in using trench warfare. But mainly the other technologies, machine gun, tanks, planes, poison gas, especially, and when we mark World War I as far as leading to large numbers of casualties. But yeah, here's a good graph of the deadliest battles in World War I. You can see like some of them, like the Marne was right at the beginning of the war. It led to more than 500,000 people dying. Gallipoli was a very long campaign, about 6-month campaign on the Turkey or the Anatolia, which is like where modern day Turkey is, to try to capture access to the Black Sea, and it leads to a large amount of deaths. The most of them, or the most deadliest battle, I could say, is the Battle of the Somme, which almost 1 million people died in that. Or about almost 1 million. Verdun, 700,000 people died in that. So these battles are very large scale. Trench warfare. It's trying to break the lines. It's just it all was it just leads to a numerous amount of casualties. Just the way they continue to fight, how the technology to make it easier to kill just gets employed much more in war. This gives you an understanding of the percentage of casualties based off of how many people were mobilized by each country. The United States, only 8% of the soldiers that were mobilized in World War I, only 8% suffered casualties. That's death or wounded. But you can see like Russia, Russia leaves in the middle of World War I because, it doesn't go well for Russia. 76% of their mobilized soldiers suffered a casualty of some kind. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, 90%. Okay, and Germany, 65%. So it was deadly for all sides, and this war itself does take a significant toll on the populations of some of these areas here. The French, have 73% of their soldiers are casualties. The French lose 10% of their population in this war because a lot of the fighting was done on the Western Front in France. And here's total war casualties by country. Germany had the most with 1.8 million, Russia 1.7 million, France 1.3 million. The United States, their casualties were so low is because they joined at the very end of the war, and they do play a role in turning the tide because the U.S. is a big industrialized power, and at that point both sides had beaten themselves up so badly that when the U.S. comes, it tips the scales in the Allied favor. And internal problems inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Germany essentially lead them to ending the war and ending the conflict. So that's my lecture on conducting World War I. And if you are more interested in it, please go ahead and feel free to check out the videos I link onto Canvas. But this is Mr. Henry signing off.